Chapter 5 The Stone or the Statue. Faithful John thus seems to be kind of a personification of that part of the unconscious which has a tendency to build up a new conscious position. We might call him the creative spirit in the unconscious. That would make him analogous to the alchemical idea of the spirit Mercurius, who is a creative spirit in the depth of nature, or, as we would say, in the depth of the unconscious. We could call him a personification of what Jung calls the transcendent function, that which unites the opposite positions. After they have abducted the princess, and the king and his bride are on the boat together, everything seems all right. But faithful John then hears the conversation between the three ravens, which predicts the dangers and the steps which can be taken against them, and which also states that if the person who saves the king tells what he knows, he will be petrified. Consequently, complete trust in faithful John is required from the prince, just the same blind faith that Kadir asked of Moses, with no questions as to the why and wherefore or dotting of the I. Faithful John, who suspects that the young king will not accept the situation and trust him in regard to his actions, all the same decides to save the king. I could skip the conversation of the three ravens because it is similar to that of the two crows on the gallows, but I cannot skip the ravens themselves. Here we have a group of ravens, birds which belong to the sun god and birds used for divination. Thus they have a connection with parapsychological facts and telepathy. They can see into the future and into secret thoughts. They represent more the male principle than the crows, which represents the female principle. Here we have a triad which alludes to all the triadic godheads as they existed in pre-Christian times in the Germanic and Celtic traditions. They later became merged into the Christian Trinity. In Dante's Inferno, the devil has three heads going in three directions, which Jung interprets as the mirroring of the upper three, that is, of the Trinity. The double triangle would be the symbol of the totality. If you cut it in two, you have the Christian tradition as the upper Trinity, and the infernal trio as the lower. That is why the underworld in folklore, which compensates the Christian position in collective consciousness, appears as a pagan triad, which in German countries has to do with the pagan god Wotan, who often appears with two other gods. The ravens have a general quality of being neither good nor bad, but pure nature. They express the truth in a way similar to that of the expression of the unconscious. Naturally, it is anthropomorphic to say that the unconscious is benevolent, for it is up to the conscious to make decisions. Since the ravens talk to each other, not to faithful John, they have no plan to make consciousness understand. They simply converse together, and you can eavesdrop. It is as though the unconscious were indifferent as to whether or not the young king was saved. But faithful John makes up his mind to save him. The three dangers are, 1, the red horse, which would induce the king to jump on it, and then would go up into the air and disappear, and which has to be shot down with the pistol in the holster on the horse itself. 2, the wedding shirt, which if put on would burn the king, and 3, the 3 drops of poison in the bride's breast. All the dangers are connected with the return to the original place. Often in fairy tales, a man or a woman goes to a faraway realm, a deeper level of the unconscious, and then when he returns to the place he left, there are dangers. Although there are dangers on the way toward the goal too, those on the return journey are generally of different character. We have to see what these different layers of the unconscious mean. Most people who interpret fairy tales loosely take crossing the ocean to the princess of the golden roof as going to the unconscious, but this cannot be correct. The characters are in the unconscious from the beginning. Since the king and faithful John and the new king are all in the unconscious from our standpoint, we cannot simply skip the fact but must ask ourselves what the different realms mean. In some fairy tales, we have more than 3. The king goes to one kingdom after another. Consequently, we must reckon not only with 2, but with 3 or 4 or 5 kingdoms, stations on the way. I would say the starting realm, the realm where the action of the tale begins, has to do with consciousness, has to do with the conscious situation, but is seen from the unconscious. Let us understand here. Consciousness as the layer of the collective consciousness represented in newspapers and publications concerned with the spirit and problems of our time. Collective consciousness as it looks at itself. We always try to realize our conscious situation by talking about it, etc., within the realm itself. But if we begin to look at dreams or the works of artists who draw their inspiration genuinely from the unconscious without much reflection, then we get another image of the situation. We get the mirrored image, a kind of photograph of how the unconscious looks at the conscious situation. All dreams, you could say, have this aspect. In a dream situation, you may behave like a fool or a hero, and then you might say that it is not the way you see yourself, but how the unconscious sees you. It is the photograph of your ego taken from the unconscious. That is one aspect where this photograph is generally opening situation in fairy tales. It depicts the conscious situation, but is seen from the unconscious. In the first photograph, the principle of the collective consciousness is aging or dying. There might be a gloomy newspaper article saying that our civilization is in need of renewal, and that might be so or not. But here the photograph says it's so. The old king is dying, and the image of the anima is rejected and removed to a distance, and so on. In this situation, the anima is seen only as an image, the portrait, in three-dimensional reality. And since it is no longer alive in psychological reality, it is further removed from the conscious into the unconscious, which is the kingdom of the anima. The return dangers are then an attempt at union of the two realms. This movement might be compared with a person's development in analysis. Often when people begin analysis, their dreams bring up a completely strange other world with anima and shadow, and in the analysis one discusses these facts, which creates the situation of the inner retort. Therefore, one says that analysis is not a relationship as in ordinary life, but is a specific relationship between two people whose concentration is fixed on the unconscious and where other facts of life are left out. The analysand may say he has difficulties with his wife or profession, etc., but you ignore the situation from the outside and look at it from within with a kind of relative exclusion of the outer situation. This exclusion is comparable to the alchemical process in a retort or a vessel. It is a rather artificial situation in which the problems are seen as an inner dream within the individual, and this perspective forces the thing into a vessel. We create this artificial situation for the purpose of introversion. People have sometimes tried to interpret fairy tales as timeless phenomena with eternal events in which the collective unconscious ages and dies, but I do not believe in this. After analyzing many European, Japanese, Chinese, and African fairy tales, you come to see that the only basic structure, so to speak, of the fairy tale is eternal. There is always the wizard, the prince and the king, and the witch and the helpful animal. But the specific setup or situation is an answer to a specific conscious situation. Therefore, if you compare the European with the Japanese, you may have the same figures, but in a different architecture. And if you go further into that, you realize that you cannot interpret a Japanese fairy tale without knowing about Japanese civilization and the conscious situation in Japan, or without knowing about Zen Buddhism and the samurai, not only from the outer situation, but from the collective conscious of the Japanese people, and only then can you understand the fairy tale. I would even go so far as to say that we should be able to date fairy tales, but I must confess that I cannot always succeed and cannot date more accurately than within about 200 or 300 years, for they depict a relatively slow process as compared with the rate of conscious development. Since the slow decay of Christian symbolism has been going on for nearly 1,000 years, from then on there have been unconscious changes. Naturally, therefore, if you have a fairy tale which compensates the Christian consciousness, it would be difficult to place it exactly into that process as to time, though I think we can date the fairy tale pretty accurately, which I shall do later. So, in one way, the unconscious taking a photograph of the conscious situation puts it into a more eternal general situation, that of the old king dying, and quite naturally, for one can see that civilizations have always decayed and come to an end. Subspecie aeternatus. The old king dying is a classical situation in human life, and then specific changes are proposed which can guarantee a change. In a personal analysis, dreams partly react in an individual way, and then the unconscious reveals the collective situation and shows that it's an eternal problem, yet one which bears the structural makeup of the time. The personal mother is the family drama, and beyond that are the archetypal dreams which say this is the general problem of the young male, the pulling away from the mother which every man has in specific form. So it may be said that these productions are partly timeless and partly specific, for neither a dream nor a fairy tale is quite unconscious. One can correctly call dreams products of the unconscious, but they are a phenomenon on the fringe of consciousness. Only those which you cannot remember are unconscious. Fairy tales share the timelessness of the unconscious with the relative time of the conscious because they are not completely in the unconscious. Fairy tales written by an author are not genuine fairy tales, but they contain to some extent the problem of the writer. Andersen's mirrored the specific religious problem of his country. He had a gift for showing what was going on underneath and produced almost genuine fairy tales, but he was highly neurotic, he never got away from his mother, and he never married. His stories have a predominantly tragic atmosphere. The connection with the animal cannot be made, just as it was not made in Andersen's own life. He could not quite free himself from his personal problem. Though they would be interesting to study, I keep away from poetical fairy tales because as far as I can see practically, no artist is able to disidentify completely with his personal problem, and that results in a different category of tales. In folklore, we have the actual bones, which dramatize more general phenomena. The problem of the return journey is to remain with the problem of the unconscious. People at such a time insist on outer solutions and say that they are relevant. Should they marry or should they change profession? But that is not the point. We have to make conscious the unconscious process, and we cannot pin it prematurely into the outer situation. The very rational person will always press for a dream interpretation to be accurate and one-sided and be shocked if it is vague and remains in the symbolic. It wants to know in a few words what is meant, for he wants to bring the situation into the outer realm. In such a case, you must insist on your interpretation, leave the thing in its own realm, and not seek outer solutions. In this way, you can reach the inner realm and live in that. But that comes the red horse difficulty, which is that naturally the outer realm has not been changed, and there remains the problem of the practical meaning. This occurs with the foreign analysand who comes here and discusses the family situation and works it out on a psychological level, but then he has to go back and wonders if the whole thing will not collapse when he gets home. Because of the analysand's change, however, the situation is different. Sometimes an analysand on return home says, "My mother must have changed in the meantime," not saying that he has changed and that this changes the whole situation. Yet the same thing arises with people who live in the same place. An artificial situation is made by the analysis, and then there is the return difficulty. And the question arises as to how the link is made with the outer life. Although it is useful to look at the psychological situation purely as psychological, after a time you have to confront the two, and then there is the danger of the new crisis and new problems come up. In this specific situation, in the realm which mirrors the conscious situation, the animal is recognized only as an image, not as a three-dimensional living reality. Now the king and faithful John come and meet the living reality of the anima. This means they meet it in the timeless, stateless realm of the unconscious. For example, in a personal situation, when a man has no relationship to his deeper feeling and emotional layers, the anima does not live for him. He has only a fantasy of her. One often comes across men who have an image relationship to the unconscious. They can accept the fact that the unconscious is full of symbolism and motifs, but if you try to convey to them that it influences their life and does things to the conscious, that it has a life of its own, and that the animal can fall ill if you don't do the right thing, then rationalism crops up. But they cannot accept that the unconscious can make them ill, or make them run into a car. Let us say that a person in a borderline situation hears voices. If you say these are manifestations of the unconscious, that they can accept, for that is quite a good thing, since they can pretend that it is not a pathological phenomenon peculiar to them. But if you tell them that the voice must be taken as a great authority to be obeyed, often an illness or accident is required before they give in, because that is a step further. Artists are often willing to accept the idea that there is an unconscious which provides the inspiration which they protect into their painting or writing, but they are awfully shy of analysis. They pretend that it would destroy their creativeness. The real fear, however, is that they might have to take what they have painted as a reality, and they fear that the statue of the goddess Venus might come down from the pedestal and embrace them. They think that they have produced it and that therefore it has no right to move, for it is their product and it has no right to come alive and grip them. They recognize the image but do not allow its living reality, which might break into their lives. All this gives us a hint for the data of the fairy story. In such a situation, the return problem arises. One begins to ask, how does that link up with actual reality, with life? Here, the anima has been recognized as an image of the anima in the golden roof, high up, while the red horse is the other aspect. The anima exists and has a sexual attraction, but at the other end she represents something divine. Dante's Beatrice would be the princess of the golden roof at the upper end, and the witch dancing with the devil would be the lower end. Mary the saint and Mary the prostitute are both images of the anima. As the prostitute, she is attraction to the other sex, the emotional attraction, the drive, and at the upper end she is all the things Dante says about Beatrice. There is a Venus Urania, the heavenly Venus, and Venus Pandomos, the profane Venus, the divine and the vulgar. The symbol of one is the dove, and of the other the sparrow. The anima contains this duality and is within herself neither an idea nor something physical, but, in her own essence, something between the opposites. A man gets torn between the two aspects, between the common, well-known attraction to the other sex and all its emotional mechanisms, and the inner experience of the highest order. In a lecture on Gerard de Nerval, Jung told us how Nerval fell passionately in love with the Parisian Midinée. He wished to write poems, like Dante, for she seemed the goddess. But French realism and Nerval's rather cynical and vulgar ideas about love caught him at the same time, and he termed her une personne ordinaire de notre siècle, and could not grasp the paradox that the ordinary little woman could be the goddess. He did something to the girl. He must have hurt her feelings in some way, but he only suggested he did something terrible because he could not stand the paradox. He ran away from her, and in his work Aurora, he describes how he dreamt that he went into a garden where a statue of a woman had broken apart. That is, his soul had petrified and fallen apart because of what he had done to the girl by running away. Another woman tried to save the situation. She thought the love affair had to do with the trouble and had to meet again. The girl came toward him, they shook hands, and he got a terrible shock from the look of sad reproach in her eyes. But they could not be reconciled. The girl died soon, and he hanged himself. Here is an illustration of someone who becomes the tragic victim of his inability to stand the anima's paradoxical aspect. She is a psychic entity who lives between the two worlds, neither goddess nor femme ordinaire, but a living force which appears in different layers of reality. We might say that is the anima, and she has to be taken as such. But the man might reply, all right, but must I go to bed with her, or must I worship her and keep away from her? For consciousness always wants to pin down what is what, and one has to keep out of this issue and not answer the question, but say that it is a living power which has to be worshipped as it is, and one must wait to see what other angle comes in. But the conscious ego says, shall I telephone her, or shall I take it only on the other side? That is the rational problem. For the other situation always comes up again, because consciousness says it must be either or. And then people go mad because the conscious situation is pinned to the one-sidedness and cannot let in the other side. In our story, the first approach to finding the anima is made appropriately through the golden artifacts. If faithful John had tried to rape her, that would not have worked. She had to be approached with the adequate means to attract her aloofness. But later, when they are back on shore, the red horse will get loose and will carry the king away. That is the outbreak of the sexual instinctive drive, which is here imaged by the horse, not by the golden roof. Naturally, though this is not said in the story, the red horse is an aspect of the princess herself. She now constellates in the animal underworld, but we must not overlook the fact that it is a horse. It does not take the rider into a swamp, which would be a sexual drive, but up into the air, a kind of Pegasus which takes one away from the earth, reality. Physical passion, if really carried by the anima, does not lead to reality, because the anima is an image, and because of the divine quality of the anima, leads to possession and unreality. It is a well-known fact that young couples are completely unreal that their sex life works all right, because then their passion carries them away into the air, away from the rather subtle in-between attitude by which consciousness stays on the earth. Since Christian prejudice is against the instinctual end of the anima projection, the tendency has been in the other direction, to become inhuman, especially, for instance, in the case of the parsons' daughters and sons who have been too prudishly brought up and are apt to become very unreal. They are as though driven by the dark horse as compensation for the aloofness of the princess of the golden roof. This danger arises when one touches the anima, for this aspect may carry one away and can be suppressed only by brutal intervention. Here is a specific situation, and in this story the only solution is to shoot the horse down, a radical operation which in analysis would correspond to saying this or that does not come into question. Although the young king does not have to shoot the horse, faithful John must, and consequently he represents the transcendent function. The urge should bring up a higher consciousness. That is, consciousness does not decide. Rather, the unconscious stops it itself. The horse, interestingly, carries the gun itself. Freud thought the instinctual drives were unilateral, and that consciousness had to deal with them, or sublimate them. Jung believes that the unconscious drive contains in it its own possibility of sacrifice in itself. The chapter on sacrifice in Symbols of Transformation explains this phenomenon. When Jung wrote that, he separated from Freud. If we look at animal nature in the outer world, it seems so obvious, for animals do not overdo sexuality or eating or fighting except under disturbed conditions, which means that in nature the instinctual drives have their own breaks. All drives do not become one-sided. They contain the inner possibility of being sacrificed, and the same applies to human drives, for they get braked and only become manic when consciousness in its devilish one-sidedness interferes wrongly. Take the parson's son who runs wild in a university town, that is, his red horse gets loose. If he is not an intellectual and not liable to neurosis, after a time he will get tired of that kind of life and want a more permanent relationship and time for his studies. The first outbreak will stop. But if he should become an advocate for free sexuality, then he will overdo it and go far beyond his nature. Such people may realize the first indications towards curbing their sexuality, but yet persist, and nature may then make them impotent. I've seen that happen several times. It is like shooting down the horse from the unconscious, which says, if you will not listen, I will shoot down the horse. Sexuality break by itself is something very brutal. It may be halted by disease of some kind. Analysis would have shown that nature wished to put on the brakes and that the situation demanding sacrifice had not been attended to. The urge toward individuation through sacrifice can break the one-sided instinctual drive which deviates too much from the middle way. Sometimes instinct is of the nature of the all-or-nothing reaction, and consciousness has to interfere by adapting to a normal, moderated use of instinct. Apart from the sexual angle, we could exemplify it also by aggression. Very aggressive people generally knock their own heads against a wall. They get hit over the head by parents and teachers and so learn repression. Then they experience the destructive nature of aggression and so repress it. But later analysis shows that they should somehow liberate it again. Such people also do not know how to hit back. They confess that if they hit back, they go too far, and so they prefer to do nothing. And then naturally they become the underdog and build up resentment since they are living below their own level, or they develop persecution ideas. Or these people may become aggressive again, go too far, and they say that they should have not tried, for trying always leads to catastrophe. They need to learn the art of letting the thing out consciously, a little at a time. If you take the lid off, all the steam rushes out. To let it out little by little requires more self-control than the all-or-nothing reaction. For consciousness has then participated in bringing out the adequate amount for civilized behavior. The middle way that lies between the all-or-nothing of the instinctive way and that harmonizes with the unconscious urge toward individuation. Faithful John sucks the poison out of the princess's breast. He alone is up to dealing with her evil side. A man's anima, when she first turns up, is pure nature, pure life containing good and evil. There is a widespread fairy tale motif of the poison maiden who kills her lover in the first night. The anima can indeed destroy a man by tempting him to recklessly live his desires, throwing out all his human values. In our story, Faithful John neutralizes the poison, but the king does not understand what he is doing. Faithful John solves all the problems for the young king, but the latter becomes suspicious of him, and even worse, John is turned into a stone statue. One feels that a curse lies at the bottom of it, but since the reason does not come out until the end, I intend to introduce another story, The Two Brothers, in which the responsible figure is revealing petrified well before the end. If we take Faithful John as the principle or urge in the collective unconscious toward building up a new dominant of collective consciousness, the maker of the new king, and therefore the representative of the transcendent function, or the self, it seems strange that he would become petrified while fulfilling this task. But if in the conscious there is a wrong attitude, then the messages from the unconscious, whether heard or seen, become misunderstood, and the conscious has a petrifying effect on them. If we think of the developments which may have taken place in our Christian civilization, then the fact that the young king and queen took the statue of the faithful John into her bedroom is typical. It stands there as a reproachful figure, and the king and queen are depressed and unhappy whenever they look at it. One might say that Sigmund Freud discovered the petrified faithful John in the bedroom of our civilization, for the living principle of the unconscious was discovered first as a fact in the form of something petrified, something not alive, not assimilated there. Thus, in the bedroom of the king and queen remains an unsolved problem. Freud himself never saw the creative living principle in the unconscious, but thought of it as something repressed, something rejected by the conscious. He was the first to discern that within our civilization a stumbling block manifests itself mainly in the relationship between the sexes, but he could not get beyond asserting the existence of such a blockage. He saw it only in its negative and destructive aspect, and as a reason for the sadness of a king and queen. That was the situation in which Freud met it first, and that, in a way, is what happened at the end of the Christian era. We discovered a principle which was a stumbling block in the sexual realm. Jung discovered that the stone statue, the block, was the personification of a dynamic principle, a principle which can come alive again and show itself as a living religious principle, but only if one sacrifices the children to it. The relationship between the sexes is in a way a seismograph which shows other disturbances as well. Most disturbances in sexual life and in relationship between the sexes are, from our standpoint, not so much a difficulty in themselves, but rather indications of a much deeper problem. Usually in cases of frigidity in women, for instance, the real problem is animus possession. If one treats the thing on its sexual level only, one does not reach its much deeper roots. Every kind of psychological disturbance shows mainly either in problems of social adaptation or in the attitude to death, or in situations such as sexual relations, i.e., wherever an instinctive reaction is needed. Because such reactions require the help of the vital and important archetypal patterns, there are archetypal situations in which the human being needs its total personality. If he has a neurotic split, he will show it in such a situation. The king and queen cannot meet completely, because between them a petrified figure always watches reproachfully and gives them such feelings of guilt that they cannot enjoy their life together. If we cast an eye at the symbolism of the stone and the statue in the tradition of alchemy, they both have a more positive meaning. The stone symbolizes in general the inner psychic God image in its totality, a redeeming God-man figure which is often described as being more complete even than Christ. The statue has most of the same significant aspects. It symbolizes the resurrected God-man, or Anthropos, Osiris in its resurrected form, and the complete union of spirit and matter. In our Western civilization today, this meaningful central religious symbol has been lost, repressed by rationalism and materialism. That is why it appears only as a stumbling block in the bedroom of the king and queen. The petrification of faithful John can be seen whenever the dominating principle of consciousness does not recognize the ever-changing aspect of the unconscious, for this failure of vision has a petrifying effect on the unconscious. The failure creates a non-elastic and rigid point of view. Whenever we theorize about the unconscious and treat words as more than descriptive terms, we petrify it and make it impossible for it to manifest as a living force. Every kind of theory can affect it as a static thing, not allowed to manifest on its own. In our story, faithful John can be saved after his petrification, and he advises the king, while the queen is absent, to cut off the heads of the two children and to smear the blood on the statue, after which faithful John comes to life and restores life to the sacrificed children. The children must have to do with certain conscious attitudes which keep faithful John in a state of petrification, and which should therefore be killed. We have to bear in mind that children and not any other figures are concerned, and see what the child means from the king's standpoint. The child is the king's future possibility, and also what he loves best in the world. The archetypal idea of the sacrifice is the same as that in the Abraham and Isaac story, for Abraham would surely have preferred to kill himself. The sacrifice of Isaac typifies the greatest possible sacrifice. We can say that, at this point, faithful John does once sacrifice one's own child. On the other hand, the child has always a double meaning. Mythologically, it can represent the self, and, depending on the context and the nuance, the infantile shadow. It is, of course, the same thing, because you might say that the realization of the self always brings with it the restoration of the naivety, the genuineness and totality of the reaction of the child. But the question is, am I still too childish, or must I again become a child? As Christ said, "Whosoever shall not receive the kingdom of God as a little child, he shall not enter therein." But one has to first become adult and then a child. Sometimes one sees that the Christian civilization has preferred to believe that one should remain the little lamb of Jesus in order to reach the kingdom of heaven. But actually what is required is the restoration of an unreflecting capacity for obeying the self. But we have to first recognize our infantile shadow and see that behind this naive attitude there is also an immature and childish attitude. It is very difficult to see the paradox. The duality of the child motif expresses the fact that the child has the double aspect of childishness and spontaneity. A Freudian analysis tends to kill any kind of spontaneity with the idea of wanting to kill infantilism. This way of interpretation can be destructive, for while it kills any kind of infantile behavior, it also exercises any kind of spontaneity and creativity and leads to a dull, unspontaneous attitude, a cramped kind of consciousness in which one is perpetually questioning oneself as to whether one's behavior is manifesting an Oedipus or Electra complex. If the fairy tale had not worked out as it did, one feels that the same situation of the dead old king would have been repeated. The same problem would have continued ad infinitum, a sterile continuation of the same conflict. Previously, the king had only given expression to his desires. He wanted to see the contents of the locked room. He wanted to have the original of the picture, and faithful John had done everything for him. But the king himself made no contribution to conquering the anima. If one looks at the story from this aspect, one might say that he had been lucky to have this old servant to manage his life for him, and that one thing he could have done, namely trust faithful John, he did not do. Perhaps that was also lucky, because there he begins to awaken. He says, "Why do these things happen?" And then he atones for his former passivity by sacrificing the children. Psychologically, that would mean the sacrifice of the immature conscious behavior. The ego is always engaged in some kind of nonsense to give up what the ego thinks is right and wants. To submit to what is happening is the great deed. The ego does not really sacrifice itself as a whole, but only its infantility. That this is a real sacrifice is proved by the fact that the king gets frightened when he hears he has to kill his beloved children. Fairy tales are extraordinarily economical in the use of feeling adjectives, and there are few psychological or feeling comments. But the story says that at first he was frightened at the thought of killing the children, but then, remembering the great loyalty of faithful John who had died for him, he took his sword and killed them. One could, therefore, say that he had developed his feeling since the petrification of faithful John. He must have suffered all the years of the children's life, and while the statue stood in his bedroom, for every time he saw it, he cried and wished he could bring it to life, and that probably had a maturing effect. When at last faithful John asked for the sacrifice, he was ready to make it. The king is roasted in his suffering while the children are growing, and then, when the magic time comes and the statue talks, the king comes to the conclusion that faithful John's return to earth matters more than anything else in the world. This conclusion expresses the fact that if one lost contact with the meaning of the self, nothing else really matters any longer, for nothing except renewed contact can replace that which is lost. The queen was in church while the sacrifice took place. The king checks on her, and on her return asks what she has done. She accepts his deed. That she was in church would mean that she was still in the service of a really religious attitude. For her, apparently, this is still a living principle. She is contained in the arms of the church. The anima is Christian. Only male consciousness has the problem. If you analyze modern men who say they do not believe in the Christian dogma, you often see that their anima still goes to church, because all those figures of the unconscious are connected far back into the past. We have all the layers within us, figures which are not as modern as consciousness. Parts of us are in the Middle Ages, parts in antiquity, parts naked on the trees. Another aspect of this problem concerns the king. He has received everything from faithful John. He has to pay the debt. He got what he wanted through faithful John. He was the recipient of the gifts. Naturally, he should be the one to pay, and not the queen. The story of the queen is normal and undramatic. Her life is not involved in the message of the fairy tale. Women are not generally so aware of the opposites. They can slip through, and therefore, unless a woman has a father complex and a very strong animus, this problem does not generally present itself so strongly. A woman lives more in terms of the continuity of life, and never mind about the opposites. You might say that the woman within the man is the same. The anima is interested in life, but not in the principle of good and evil, or truth and its opposite. It's the logos principle, to which man is more devoted, which makes the problem of the opposites acute. In Jewish civilization, there is no female goddess. The lawgiver was Yahweh. Either you followed it or not, and that creates the problem of ethical response. In the Greek religion, there are as many goddesses as gods, and the ethical problem is not so acute. Next, I will study two grim fairy tales which run parallel to each other, the two brothers and the golden children. In both stories, the pairs of figures which represent the opposites are of equal rank, and there is no servant and no king, but one marries and the other remains a lonely figure, just as faithful John did. Here, where it is even more likely that a marriage quaternity might be established, it does not take place. We must concentrate on what the lonely figure could mean. The two brothers. Once upon a time there were two brothers, one rich and one poor. The rich brother, a goldsmith, was bad-hearted. The poor brother, who made brooms, was a talkative, good man. The poor brother had two boys, twins, as like each other as two drops of water. The boys went in and out of the rich uncle's house and sometimes found a scrap to eat. The poor man went to the forest to fetch twigs for his brooms, and there saw a golden bird, more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. He picked up a stone, threw it at the bird, and luckily hit it. But only a golden feather fell to the ground. The bird flew away. The man took the feather to his brother, who said it was real gold, and gave him money for it. The next day, the broom maker climbed a beech tree to cut off a few branches, and the same bird flew by. When the man looked, he found a nest with a golden egg in it. He took the egg home and brought it to his brother, who said that it was real gold, and gave his brother its value in money. Then the goldsmith said he wanted the bird itself. The poor man went a third time into the wood, and again saw the golden bird sitting on the tree. He threw a stone at it, brought it to the ground, and took it to his brother, who did as before. The poor man went home quite contented, thinking that now he could help himself. But the goldsmith, clever and cunning, knew very well the kind of bird he had. He called his wife and told her to roast the bird and be careful that no part was lost, for he wanted to eat it all himself. It was a magic bird, and whoever ate its heart and liver would find a piece of gold every morning under his pillow. His wife prepared the bird and put it out on the spit to roast. Now, it happened that the woman had to go out of the kitchen to do the other work, and the two children of the poor broom maker came in, stood in front of the spit, and turned around a couple of times. And as two little pieces fell out of the bird into the pan, one said to the other, "We'll eat those two little bits. I'm so hungry, and nobody will notice." The woman came back and noticed that they were eating something and asked them what it was. "A couple of little bits that fell out of the bird," they answered. "They must have been the liver and heart," said the terrified woman, and in order that her husband should not notice anything, she quickly killed a chicken and put the liver and heart with the rest of the golden bird. When it was done, she took it to the goldsmith, who ate it all up by himself, leaving nothing over. Next morning, when he put his hand under his pillow, nothing was there. The two children had no idea what a piece of luck had happened to them. Next morning, when they got up, something rolled onto the floor, and they saw it was two pieces of gold. They brought them to their father, who wondered how that happened. When this happened every day, he went to his brother and told him the strange story. The goldsmith saw at once what had happened, and in revenge, since he was mean and hard-hearted, told his brother that the children were in league with something evil, and that he should not take the gold nor let the children remain any longer in his house, for the devil would ruin him. The brother was afraid of the devil, so, though it made him very unhappy, he took the two boys into the woods, and with a heavy heart left them there. The children ran about trying to find their way home, but could not. At last they met a hunter who asked them who they were, and they told him what their father had done, and about the piece of gold they each under their pillows every morning. Jesus. "That's nothing bad," said the huntsman, "as long as you remain honest and don't turn lazy." Since the good man liked the children and had none of his own, he took them home with him, saying he would be their father to them. He taught them how to hunt, and he put the money by for them so that they could have it if they wanted it later on. Jeez. When they were grown, the huntsman said he would test their shooting, but for a long time nothing came by. At last, the huntsman saw some snow geese flying in the shape of a triangle, and told them to shoot down the end geese, which they did. Afterward, more geese came by in the form of the figure 2, and again the boys were successful in shooting down the corner geese. Whereupon the hunter said they were now trained huntsmen. That evening, the two brothers refused to touch their food until the hunter had granted them their request to let them go out into the world. Their request granted, on the appointed day the huntsman gave each a gun and a dog, and let them take as much of the money they had been saved as they wished. On parting, he gave them a knife, saying that if ever they separated at the dividing of the ways, they should stick the knife into a tree. When either came back, he would see how things went with his brother, for in the direction in which the other had gone, the knife would be rusty if he were dead and bright if he lived. The two brothers came into a vast forest, and since it was impossible to get out of it during the day, they spent the night there and ate what they had in their knapsack. The same thing happened the next day. With nothing left to eat, they said they must shoot something, and one loaded his gun. An old hare came by and begged for his life, saying that in exchange he would give 2 young ones. But when the 2 little hares came out, they played so happily together that the brothers hadn't the heart to kill them, and the hares followed them. The same thing happened with a fox, a wolf, a bear, and a lion, so that in the end the hunters had 2 hares, 2 foxes, 2 wolves, 2 bears, and 2 lions. It increased hunger. The fox thereupon led them to a village where they bought food. After having fed their animals, they went on further. Since they could not find any work, they decided they must separate. They divided the animals between them, swore brotherly love to each other until death, stuck the knife into a tree, and then one brother went east and the other west. The younger came with his animals to a town that was covered with a black crape. He went to an inn and asked if he could put up his animals. The innkeeper gave him a stall which had a hole in the wall, through which the hare went out and brought in a cabbage, and the fox a chicken and a cock. But the wolf, bear, and lion, too big to get out, were fed by the innkeeper. Afterward, the brother asked why the town was draped in black, and was told that the next day the king's daughter was to die, for she had to be given to a dragon, who every year had to have a young girl. The princess was the last girl left, and if he didn't have her, he would destroy the whole land. Many young men had tried to kill the dragon, but all had been killed themselves, and the king had promised his daughter and his kingdom to whoever should kill the dragon. The next morning the huntsman went up the dragon's hill with his animals. On the altar of a little church he found 3 beakers on which was written that whoever drank their contents would be the strongest man in the world and should have the sword which stood at the doorway. The huntsman first tried to pull up the sword, but couldn't until he had emptied the beakers. Then he could do it easily. When the princess, the king, and the courtiers came out, they saw the huntsman on the mountain and took him for the dragon. The princess came up the mountain and found the young man instead of the dragon. He comforted her and locked her up in the church. Soon out came the 7-headed dragon and asked the young man what he was doing there. The young man said he was going to fight him. Out of his 7 mouths the dragon spewed fire, which should have ignited the dry grass, and so burnt up the young man. But the animals trotted it out. Then the dragon went for the young man, who promptly cut off 3 of his heads. In a rage, the dragon spewed fire over the man, but the huntsman cut off another 3 heads, and finally the last head, after which his animals tore the rest of the dragon to pieces. When the man opened the church door, he found the princess senseless on the ground, terrified by the fight. When she came to, he showed her the remains of the dragon and told her she was free. She was very happy, and said that now she should be her dear husband, as her father had promised. Thereupon she took the coral chain she was wearing off her neck and divided it up among the animals as a reward. She gave her handkerchief to the man who cut the 7 tongues from the 7 dragon heads and wrapped them up in it. Since he was so tired after the battle, he proposed that they should sleep for a little while, and he told the lion to watch over them while they slept. But the lion asked the bear to watch, and the bear asked the wolf the fox, and the fox the hare. Since the poor hare was also tired and couldn't hand the watch over to anyone else, they all went to sleep. But the marshal had watched everything from afar off, and when he saw what had happened, being a bad man, he took the sword and cut off the huntsman's head with it, seized the girl, and brought her down the mountain. She woke up and was terrified, but the marshal said she was now in his power and should say he had killed the dragon. When she refused, he threatened to kill her. So she promised. The marshal then went home with her, said he had killed the dragon, and demanded the princess as his wife. The king asked the girl if it was true, and she said, "Oh yes, it must be true, but the wedding must not take place until a year and a day have gone by." For she thought during the time she might hear something something of her dear huntsman. Meanwhile, the animals still slept. 3 times the bumblebee came and sat on the hare's nose, and the 3rd time he stung him and woke him up. As soon as he was awake, he woke the others, and when the lion saw that the girl was gone and the man dead, he roared and cried out, "Who has done this?" All blamed a different animal for not having woken the other up. Only the poor hare had no one to blame, so he was the guilty party. To save his skin, he said he knew of a root that would heal any illness, and in 24 hours he fetched it from far away. The lion put the young man's head on again, backwards, and when he saw the girl was gone, he thought she had run away from him. At noon, when he wanted to eat, he noticed that his head was on the wrong way, and asked what had happened to him. So the lion pulled off his head again, and turned it around, and the hare healed the wound. The sad huntsman wandered from town to town, making his animals dance, and just a year later he came to a town all decked out in red. When he asked why, he was told that the king's daughter was to be married to the marshal who had saved her from the dragon by killing him, and then all the animals had to help. The hare had to fetch bread from the king's table, the fox roast meat, the wolf vegetables, the bear sweet stuff, and the lion wine. And each time an animal went to the princess, who knew it by the corals on its neck, she gave it what it wanted. The huntsman and his animals ate the food together and were happy because the huntsman realized that the princess loved him. Then the huntsman went himself to the court and took him with him the princess's handkerchief with the 7 dragon tongues in it. For the king had sent somebody to fetch him when his daughter would not tell him about the 5 animals which had come to her in the palace and gone away again. But the huntsman first asked the king to send him royal clothes in which to come and a carriage with 6 horses and servants, which his daughter said he should do. And the king went out to meet the huntsman, whose animals all followed him. And he sat at the table by the king and his daughter, with the unsuspecting marshal opposite. Then the 7 heads of the dragon were brought out, and the king said that because the marshal had killed the dragon, he was giving him his daughter. But the huntsmen opened their mouths and asked where their tongues were. Then the marshal went very white, and said the dragons had no tongues. The huntsman replied that liars should have no tongues, and that dragon tongues were the sign of the victor. Then he opened the handkerchief and put each tongue back into the proper mouth, and showed the handkerchief with the princess's name embroidered on it to the princess, and asked to whom she had given it, and she answered, "To the man who killed the dragon." Then he called his animals to him, took the collars off each of them, and showed them to the princess, and asked to whom the corals belonged. She told what had happened, and then the huntsman explained that when he was tired and slept after the battle, the marshal had come and cut off his head and carried away the king's daughter, pretending that he had killed the dragon. And the princess said that, since the truth had come out independently of her, she could confirm it, though she had promised the marshal not to say anything. So the marshal was torn to pieces by 4 oxen. The marriage was celebrated and everyone was happy. But one day the huntsman, now king, wanted to go hunting. He followed a white doe so far into the woods that he got lost. He made a fire with his animals around him, prepared to spend the night there. Then he heard voices coming from the tree and saw an old woman sitting up above him, who complained that she was cold. He told her to come down and warm herself, but she, afraid of the animals, threw down the stick, saying he should touch the animals with it so they should not hurt her. He did so. They turned to stone, and when she came down, she turned the man into stone too. When the other brother went to look at the knife, he saw it was half rusted over on one side, and knew some misfortune had befallen his brother. When he came to the city gates, the guards asked if they should announce him. He thought he must be taken for his brother, and they could accept that, so that he might know it better how to help him. Consequently, he was taken to the palace, and everybody, even the princess, thought he was the right king. He had to explain that he lost his way in a wood. At night, when When he was brought to the royal bed, he laid a naked sword between them. The princess, not knowing what it meant, did not dare to ask. After a few days, when the brother had found out all he wanted to know, he said he must go hunting again. They all tried to dissuade him, but he insisted. Again, the white doe came to him. Later, like his brother, he made a fire. The same old witch sat up in the tree, but when she threw him the stick, he refused to touch his animals with it, and told her she could come down, or he would fetch her down. Then he shot at her, but she was proof against that. So he took 3 silver buttons from his coat and shot with them, and she fell to the ground with a loud cry. He then put his foot on her neck and threatened to throw her into the fire if she did not say where his brother and his animals were. So she told him he lay in a ditch and was turned to stone along with all his animals. He forced her then to bring him to the place and to deliver his brother and the animals under peril of being burnt to death. So the brother and the animals and many other people also were brought back to life. Then they bound the witch and burnt her, whereupon the whole wood lighted up, and they could see the royal palace 3 hours' distance from where they were. As they went toward the palace, the brother told the king how he had been taken for him, and how he had eaten and drunk as the king, and even lain in the king's bed. The king, when he heard that, became angry and jealous and cut off his brother's head. Soon, however, he regretted his deed and cried, and the hare had to go and fetch the root again and heal the huntsman, who noticed nothing at all of his wound. Then the two separated and entered the town from 2 different sides, so that the guard from each gate come to the old king and announce the young king's arrival. The king knew that the gates were an hour's distance from each other, and said it was not possible. But when the 2 brothers appeared, the old king told his daughter to say which was her husband, which she was able to do by the collars which the king's animals wore. When they went to bed that night, the queen asked the king why he had put the sword between them that night before, since she thought he wanted to kill her. And that was how the king knew his brother had been faithful to him. The Golden Children. A poor man and woman had nothing but a little hut and the meager food they got from catching fish. But it happened one day that the man sat by the water and threw out his net and caught a golden fish. As he looked at it in amazement, the fish began to talk and said, "Listen, fisherman, if you'll throw me back into the water, I will turn your hut into a beautiful castle." But the fisherman answered, "What would be the good of that to me when I have nothing to eat?" But the fish said that also should be attended to, for there would be a cupboard in the castle in which all the drawers were full of the most wonderful food, as much as he wanted. "If that's so," said the man, "I can certainly do you a favor." "Yes," said the fish, "but on condition that you tell nobody in the world, whoever it may be, how your good luck came about. If you say one single word, everything will be lost." So the man threw the magic fish back into the water and went home. But where his hut had been, there was now a large castle. He stared at it, went in, and found his wife dressed in beautiful clothes and sitting in a beautiful room. She was delighted and said, "Husband, how has this happened? I am very pleased about it." "Yes," said the man, "I like it too, but I'm very hungry. Give me something to eat." But the wife answered, "I have nothing and don't know how to do anything in the new house." "That doesn't matter," said the man. "There's a big cupboard over there. Open that." When they opened the cupboard, they found in it cakes, meat, fruit, and wine. Delighted, they sat down and ate and drank together. When they had eaten all they wanted, the woman said, "Well, where do all these riches come from?" "Oh," said he, "don't ask me that. I mustn't tell you. If I tell anyone, our luck will be over." "Good," said she. "If I shouldn't know, then I don't want to." But she didn't mean that, for she was tormented night and day and bothered him so much that in his impatience he blurted out that it all came through the magic golden fish he had caught and freed again. And as soon as he had said that, the beautiful castle with the cupboard disappeared, and they were back again in the old fisherman's hut. So the man had to begin all over again. As luck would have it, he caught the golden fish. And the fish said he would give him his freedom. He would once again give him the castle with the cupboard full of food, but this time he should be strong and not tell anyone. But the same thing happened. The woman said she would rather not have the riches, for if she didn't know where they came from, she would have no peace. Again the man went fishing, and for the third time caught the golden fish. "Listen," said the fish, "I see that I shall always fall into your hands, so take me home and cut me into 6 pieces. Give 2 to your wife to eat, 2 to your horse, and put 2 in the ground, and you will receive a blessing." The man did as he had been told. The 2 pieces he put in the earth produced 2 golden lilies. The horse bore 2 golden fowls, and the fisherman's wife 2 golden children. The children grew big and beautiful, and the lilies and fowls grew marvelously too. The children said they wanted to ride out into the world on their 2 golden horses. But their father said, how could he bear it if they went away and he didn't know what was happening to them? They answered that the 2 golden lilies would remain, and by them he could tell whether all went well with his sons, for if the lilies remained fresh, the children would be well. If they faded, they were sick, and if they died, the children would be dead. So they rode away and came to an inn where there were many people, who when they saw the 2 golden children, began to laugh and mock them. One of the children was ashamed and wouldn't go out into the world, but turned back and went home to his father. The other went on and came to a big forest, and when he wanted to go through it, the people said he couldn't because the forest was full of robbers who would do him harm, and that when they saw that he and his horse were golden, they would kill them both. But he wouldn't be frightened and insisted on going on. He took a bear skin and covered himself and his horse with it, and rode into the forest. After he had gone a little way, he heard noises and voices in the bushes. One cried, "There goes me." But the other answered, "Let him go. He's only got an old bear skin and is as poor as a church mouse. What should we do with him?" So the golden child rode happily through the forest. One day he came to a village where he saw a beautiful girl that he thought she must be the most beautiful girl in the world. He was so much in love with her that he went to her and said, "I love you with all my heart. Will you marry me?" As the girl looked him too, she agreed and said she would be his wife and would be true to him as long as she lived. So they got married and were very happy together. And when the bride's father came home and saw that his daughter was married, he was very much surprised and asked where the bridegroom was. She showed him the golden child, who, however, still wore his bearskin. Then the father waxed angry and said his daughter should never marry a man in a bearskin. He wanted to kill the bridegroom. However, when the bride said that he was her husband and she loved him, her father quieted down. But, unable to rid himself of the thought, he got up early in the next morning to see whether his daughter's husband was an ordinary ragged beggar. When he looked, he saw a beautiful golden man in the bed and the bearskin on the floor. So he went away and thought what a good thing it was that he had controlled his anger, for he would have committed a great crime. The golden child dreamt that he went to the hunt on a beautiful stag, and when he awoke in the morning, told his wife he wanted to go hunting. But she was afraid and begged him not to go, saying that he could easily meet with misfortune. But he insisted, got up, and went into the forest, and before long a beautiful stag stood in front of him, exactly as in his dream. He wanted to shoot it, but the stag ran off. He went after it through the bushes and over the ditches all through the day, but in the evening the stag disappeared. And when the golden child looked around, he saw a little house, and in it was a witch. He knocked at the door, and the old woman came out and asked what he wanted so late in the middle of the forest. He asked if she had seen a stag. "Yes," she said, "I know the stag well." Then a little dog, which came out of the house with her, barked at the golden child furiously, and he said, "Be quiet, you little beast, or I'll shoot you dead." "What?" said the old witch furiously. "You'd kill my little dog, would you?" And she changed him into a stone, so that his bride waited for him in vain and thought that, as she had feared, Something must have happened to him. But at home, the other brother was standing by the golden lilies when suddenly one fell over. Oh, he thought, something must have happened to my brother. I must go, and perhaps I can save him. His father, however, thought he should stay at home, for if he lost him as well, what would he do? But the other insisted and got on his golden horse. He came to the great forest where his brother lay like a stone. The old witch came out of her house and called to him and wanted to tempt him in, but he didn't go near her. Instead, he said he would shoot her dead if she didn't bring his brother back to life. Unwillingly, she touched the stone with her finger, and he immediately returned to life. The two children were happy to see each other again and rode out of the wood together, the one to his bride and the other to his father. The father said he knew that one son had freed the other, for the lily had suddenly stood up and blossomed again. So they all lived happily together until the end of their days. We'll see these stories only to throw some light on the tale of faithful John and on the problem of the shadow and leave out all the other details. We have the interesting motif of the golden bird, or fish, which is responsible for the birth of the brothers, or which turns them into magic figures. The bird, or fish, is a single principle. It is a genuine symbol of the self which comes from the depths of the unconscious, rather like the intuitive ideal of wholeness, and this unitary principle is responsible for the origin of the dual situation in the conscious world. The principle of evil in the story of faithful John is in the background only. It is the poison in the princess of the golden roof, which faithful John has to suck out. The old king in this story died without making further difficulties, but evil is still so active that in the end faithful John is petrified. In the story of the shoemaker and the tailor, the former is thrown out in the end. He is rejected and lands under the gallows. But in the story of faithful John, evil is in the poison and acts like a curse. Here we have taken another story in which evil is personified in the form of a witch. In comparing the stories and looking at the symbol of the witch, we might ask how and why this old woman is responsible for the destruction of the one principle. It is easy to believe that the unconscious cannot manifest itself when evil comes from a wrong attitude in consciousness. This is what we tell people all the time, that they have a wrong attitude in their conscious, and that therefore the unconscious cannot manifest itself in helpful ways and is reduced to inactivity. The unconscious, reduced to complete inactivity, can only produce feelings of guilt and neurotic symptoms. But if we look more closely at the situation, we sometimes see that it is more complicated. As shown in the story of the golden children, evil does not come directly from a wrong attitude in consciousness, but from a neglected archetype in the unconscious, from the witch. The witch is an archetypal aspect of the Great Mother. She is a neglected mother goddess, the goddess of the earth in her destructive aspect. The Egyptian mother goddess, Isis, is called the Great Magician and the Great Witch. When angry, she is the witch, and when benevolent, the redeeming, all-bestowing mother who gives birth to the gods. In such a figure, you have both aspects of the archetype of the mother, for she has a light and dark side, the witch and the benevolent and maternal. The Indian goddess Kali also can appear as the life giver or the bringer of great destruction. In fairy tales, which, in the main, are under the influence of Christian civilization, the archetype of the Great Mother, like all others, is split into two aspects. The Virgin Mary, for example, is cut off from her shadow side and represents only the light side of the mother image. Consequently, as Young points out, the moment when the figure of the Virgin Mary became more important was also the time of the witch persecutions. Since the symbol of the Great Mother was too one-sided, the dark side got projected onto women, which gave rise to the persecution of witches. Since the shadow of the Great Mother was not contained in any officially worshipped symbol of the goddess, the figure of the mother became split into the positive mother and the destructive witch. In fairy tales, innumerable witches and even the Great Mother appear in many stories, as Albert Dietrich proved in his book Mutter Erde. There is, for instance, the figure of the devil's grandmother or Great Mother, and in fairy tales the devil therefore lives with the old woman, i.e. his own mother, the Great Mother Earth. Behind the popularity of the Black Madonnas lies the same problem, for they too have to do with the black goddess Isis. The legend concerning the Black Madonna in Eisendeln holds that once the monastery was burned down, and since then the statue has remained blackened. But one can see that it is not so. She is black, and she is black because she is more potent and magical and effective than she would be as an ordinary white woman. Here the archetype of the great Mother Earth comes in through the back door. For if an archetype is excluded by dogmatic teaching, it necessarily returns by the back door. Being despised by the ruling collective consciousness, the archetype here does something horrible. For the female principle of evil does not attack the king directly, but hits at another figure, i.e., Faithful John. Faithful John gets attacked by evil, and the king is then hit secondarily, for he has to sacrifice his children. Yet this is a typical archetypal event, which one also has to keep in mind in the treatment of individual cases. The neurotic complexes in an individual act directly when something in the unconscious is rejected. The disturbance goes around the corner, and the rejected content attacks something else. For instance, a man with a negative mother complex is caught by a tremendous but half unconscious ambition and power drive which apparently makes him very successful in life. But he has a dim feeling that something is wrong, especially in his relationship to women. In analysis, you discover that the power drive sits like an evil animal on his sexual life. Within the unconscious, it harms the sex instinct, but does not directly harm consciousness. Through dream analysis, you then can see that there are two factors in the unconscious which collide. For within the dream, the two unconscious principles fight, and you feel that consciousness cannot be made responsible, but indirectly it is responsible for the battle in the unconscious because of a certain wrong attitude. In the field of consciousness, people often show an indirect conflict. They say they want to marry, but are always unlucky. Something in the unconscious stops them. It is not that they who have the conflict, they say, but something goes wrong, and they do not know why. You can then see that their eros is attacked by another unconscious factor, and that destruction goes on mechanically by itself in the unconscious, consciousness being only indirectly responsible. Consequently, you have to make a detour and follow the dreams. In such a situation, consciousness has not explicitly done any harm. The old king never harmed Faithful John. Yet, obviously, some force was neglected in the kingdom which first hit Faithful John, and then the young king. In our new story of the Golden Children, you see that it is the archetype of the Great Mother who avenges herself by attacking the transcendent function, the process of becoming conscious, the process toward individuation, and that is worse than if she attacked the conscious part directly. The theory of repression is not always applicable. Often, omission or unawareness of a factor has directly destructive effect on the whole process of individuation. On the other hand, it can be said that in the worst neurosis, the climax is also the healing place. One must look for the healing fact in the worst spot because there lies the trouble and the urge toward individuation. The largely neglected archetype of the feminine in Christian civilization destroys the whole process of individuation, and the whole problem has to be rediscussed from those angles. The story of the Golden Children points to still another problem. In the previous story, we had the figures of the new king and Faithful John, but now there are brothers of the same age and rank. They are again each other's shadows. A shadow, it must not be forgotten, is only relative. But they are here twin figures, characterized in only two ways. For one stays at home, disgusted by the world's stupidity, and the other goes out into the world. There is a similar story in old Egypt, Anub and Bata. The twin goes out into the world and marries, for he is the part of the consciousness which tends onward, living out and getting involved in it. And as the anima is the great entangler and the Maya who involves him in good and evil, naturally he should be the one to marry the princess and also fall for the evil behind the anima, the goddess of life and death, the witch. the tendency toward getting involved in the process of life and death. He risks himself in life, the condition for becoming conscious. If you analyze elderly people who in the first half of life have escaped life, you realize how much an unlived life mutilates the possibility of becoming conscious. You realize how much not having lived and risked by throwing yourself into the hopeless conflict is really a mutilation of the possibility of individuation. On the other hand, the one who throws himself into the conflict and tries to swim in life ends up petrified, is petrified in a deeper sense by the life principle itself, the Great Mother, for she turns into a death-bringing principle. So just the one who takes the risk is the one petrified, and at that moment the one who stayed out of life and did not get involved physically or spiritually in the life process is the great Redeemer who can finish off the witch, who can see through her and put an end to her destructiveness, to the destructiveness of the anima, and redeem his brother. In the light of our civilization, this has happened in the following way. Christian civilization is relatively an extroverted civilization compared with that of the East, and therefore the official symbolism involves the active brother. In the chapter on the king and queen in Mysterium Conjunctionis, Young discusses the text of a 15th century English alchemist, Ripley, in which there comes first the genuine union of the king and queen, who give birth to the philosopher's child, the philosopher's stone. But, being a churchman, Ripley then brings in an unusual second conjunctio. Young says that Ripley introduces the second conjunctio because he has in mind the marriage of the Lamb with the church, and in this, Young says, brings to light a divergence between the alchemical image and the Christian symbol of the self. It is difficult to understand, after the first conjunctio, the union of the conscious with the unconscious principle, why there has to be a second union, unless one sees that the new dominant of the consciousness has to unite with the corpus mysticum of mankind. The lonely alchemists do not have the motif of the marriage of the Lamb, because in this is contained the idea of the final sacrifice of the individual to the community, an idea lacking in alchemy. The alchemical philosopher's stone is the hermit's idea, the goal for the lonely individual. The stone represents the union of opposites, of the male and female within. But for the community, the stone does not belong to any. It is rather like the treasure in the field which the man found and hid again. So the wonderful pearl, the philosopher's stone, remains the miraculous secret of the individual, though the old masters said they did not hide the secret. That the stone is kept secret and not kept secret can be explained this way. These are two opposites in which the process of individuation culminates. When a new symbol of the divinity is built up during the process, the divinity is either sacrificed to strengthen the community or kept secret within the individual. If Young had founded a sect of Jungians, then one might say that the king was sacrificed in a second conjunctio. That event would build up a new community and would revitalize an organization as secret mystical clubs did. This possibility raises a very urgent problem. People say, what you are doing is wonderful, but what does that do for Europe? How does it help in our situation in time? Here and there, a lonely individual is helped, but that should be altered and the masses enriched. People say that we should make a collective recipe, easily understood, and feed it to the masses to save the Christian civilization. But the second marriage would kill the original symbol, for then the individual symbol marries the community. This was the Christian idea. Christ married the church, and will do so till the end of days. Ultimately, then, the process of individuation is sacrificed to establish a new community. The opposite idea, that the found symbol is again hidden and does not marry the world and the community but remains a secret of the lonely person, the alchemist hermit, is cryptically imaged in the Mudaka Upanishad. Two birds, inseparable friends, cling to the same tree. One of them eats the sweet fruit, the other looks on without eating. In Hawaiian myth, a man, parallel to our Adam figure, was whole in the beyond, but then was called to earth. Only one half of him came down, however, and that is why the Adam of this civilization is called the half-man. At the end of the world, the myth intimates he will reach his other half. In many primitive civilizations, every person born is believed to have a twin brother, his placenta. Rather than enter the world, the twin is dried and wound around the neck, and thus remains as a spirit in the beyond. At the moment of death, the two halves meet again. The Upanishad continues. On the same tree, man sits grieving, immersed, bewildered by his own impotence. But when he sees the other Lord contented and knows his glory, then his grief passes away. When the seer sees the brilliant Maker and Lord of the world as the person who has his source in the Brahman, then he is wise, and shaking off good and evil, he reaches the highest oneness, free from passions. In the Shvetashvara Upanishad, it is said, there is one unborn being, female, red, white, and black uniform, but producing manifold offspring. There is one unborn being, male, who loves her and lies by her. There is another who leaves her, the sword which the brother placed between himself and his brother's wife, while she is eating what has to be eaten. In life one eats what has to be eaten. All these quotations are amplified in the Maitreya Brahmana Upanishad. He who sees this does not see death, nor disease, nor misery, for seeing he sees all objectively, not as affecting him subjectively, he becomes all everywhere. He becomes Brahman. There is the person in the eye. There is he who walks as in sleep, he who is sound asleep, and he who is above the sleeper. These are the four conditions of the self, and the fourth is greater than all. Brahman with 1 foot moves in 3, and the Brahman with 3 feet is in the last. It is that both the true in the fourth condition and the untrue in the 3 conditions may have their desert, that the great self seems to become 2, yes, that he seems to become 2. These 2 brothers in the fairy tale, then, are the figures of the 2 aspects of the self. They are secretly one, just as the golden children in our story are secretly one because they are of the same flesh of the one fish. The conflict exists only as long as consciousness exists, and as long as consciousness exists, the conflict is inevitable. But it is a seeming conflict. One should remember their secret oneness and all that it implies.